Humans have always longed to live in a paradise, a place without disease, war, or oppression. Although a true paradise may not exist, with the advancement of science and technology, we are gradually approaching what was once considered paradise in the eyes of the ancients. In 1798, British economist Thomas Malthus proposed the population theory, pointing out that population growth does not necessarily lead to prosperity and well-being. On the contrary, it can even cause societal stagnation. This is known as the Malthusian trap. A series of animal experiments have yielded terrifying results, suggesting that a crisis could stem from population causes. Among them is the gruesome experiment on mice, conducted by John B. Calhoun, an animal-loving scholar. John B. Calhoun had a special interest in studying birds and had articles published in Animal Lover magazines at the age of 15. In 1947, he approached a neighbor who owned a plot of land, nearly 1,000 square meters in size, to use it for his experiment. Calhoun decided to build a paradise for mice, a place where they could live free from worries and dangers. He eventually named it the Mouse City. With this plot of land, the size of Mouse City was not small. It was estimated to accommodate up to 5,000 mice. Calhoun provided abundant food and water for the mice and minimized the impact of disease and predators. The mice were only allowed to operate within the confines of the city. However, the development of Mouse City did not go as smoothly as expected. In fact, it was somewhat strange. Calhoun initially introduced 5 pregnant female mice, but the reproduction rate within this space was not as high as he had imagined. The number of mice in the research area never exceeded 200 and stabilized at around 150, far fewer than what this artificial paradise could accommodate. The mice clustered into groups and only foraged at specific locations. This might have been the first experiment that drew Calhoun's attention to population density. 5 years after the failure of the Mouse City project, Calhoun joined the U.S. National Institute of Mental Health, NIMH, where he had better conditions to design experiments on mice. At that time, Calhoun had a small team working with him. They improved the experimental environment for the mice and specially designed the enclosure so that the artificial paradise could function more effectively. The enclosure now measured only about 4.5 meters in length and 3 meters in width, divided into 4 zones separated by electric fences. Each zone was equipped with unlimited food and water, and there was also a multi-stream apartment that the mice could enter via a spiral ramp. The 4 zones, separated by electric mesh, were not entirely isolated from one another. They were connected in pairs by 3 small bridges. Specifically, these 4 zones could be considered the 4 quadrants of a Cartesian coordinate system, in which only direct bridges existed in a way that the route between the first zone and the 4th zone formed a U-shape. Calhoun also designed a special feeding system. Solid food was kept behind mesh panels, making the process of collecting food somewhat difficult. In the first generation of mice, the residents were arranged systematically with a total of 32 mice evenly split between males and females, all of whom were adults of reproductive age. According to the plan, the mice in this environment would reproduce rapidly, and their number would soon exceed the limit of 40 individuals within a short time. However, Calhoun would not stop the experiment immediately. He intended to let the mouse population grow to 80 and observe them. At first, the female mice were evenly distributed across the 4 zones, but after the fights among the male mice concluded, the stronger males took possession of more of the female. Due to the design of 4 zones and 3 connecting bridges, a large number of low-set mice, male mice, ended up congregating in zones 2 and 3, while zones 1 and 4 became the territories of higher-set males. At the bridges, the mice established checkpoints that prevented individuals from moving freely. Weaker mice that crossed into zones 2 and 3 to find food could not return, leaving only a small number of males in zones 1 and 4. At this point, something strange occurred. The low submass male mice living in zones 1 and 4, despite being surrounded by females, showed no interest in heterosexual mating. Instead, they approached the higher submass males. And yet, the dominant males did not reject these advances. The mouse population in zones 2 and 3 became increasingly dense due to the constant appearance of new litters, mice that crossed over and never returned. At the same time, the mice's eating behavior began to change as they adapted to Calhoun's feeding device. They refused to eat alone and would only engage in the activity of extracting food from the mesh if and only if other mice were present. The pressure from the population density and the act of feeding created a behavioral pattern that Calhoun termed the behavioral sink. The mice began to develop harmful behaviors. Under the influence of the behavioral sink, female mice increased their social interactions but showed a reduced ability to care for their offspring. And since baby mice are heavily dependent on their mothers, the overall population faced the risk of decline. Each time a female mouse left the nest, it often abandoned a significant number of pups in the old shelter. Worse still, when the females entered estrus, being confined within the enclosure meant they couldn't escape from the sexually aggressive males, and the violent mating behavior further harmed the young. At times, the mortality rate in the mouse enclosure reached as high as 96%. Among the dominant males, behavioral sink caused them to become frenzied, frequently attacking other mice in the same enclosure, even the young. As for the weaker mice, Calhoun observed characteristics that allowed him to divide them into 3 distinct groups. The first group was referred to as pansexual. These mice did not participate in social dominance struggles, but instead tried to mate with any other mouse they could, regardless of gender or age. Very few individuals rejected this behavior. The second group was called the somnambulists by Calhoun. These mice moved slowly, interacted very little with others, avoided social activities almost entirely, and were rarely approached by other mice. However, they were extremely meticulous about grooming themselves and never displayed violent behavior. The third group, which surprised Calhoun the most, was labeled the probers. These individuals were hyperactive, constantly seeking opportunities to mate with mice of both sexes. Even when attacked by higher sexual males, they obsessively pursued females in estrus. When they stumbled upon nests with abandoned pups, the probers found themselves an additional source of nourishment. In addition, John B. Calhoun observed that social behaviors among the mice became more frequent, such as eating together. However, some female mice would abandon their young or interrupt caregiving to engage in social interactions. Moreover, female mice were increasingly subjected to forced mating by males at all times. Under the influence of androgens, male hormones, they began to exhibit infanticidal behavior. The mortality rate of the pups reached as high as 96%, and the reproductive function of the entire mouse population was nearly brought to a standstill. In politics, John B. Calhoun later selected the 4 healthiest male and female mice in an attempt to restore the population, but not a single pup survived to weaning age. The Mouse City experiment had to be halted once again. Later, Calhoun conducted several similar experiments, but none yielded better results. The entire mouse populations all eventually died out. In 1962, John B. Calhoun published the findings of 6 experiments, all of which showed abnormal behaviors caused by excessively high population density. He termed this phenomenon behavioral sink. Unwilling to abandon his goal, Calhoun went on to create a new habitat for mice known as Universe 25. The entire experiment took 11 years from planning to completion. Universe 25 was a true paradise for mice. In addition to unlimited food and water, the electric barriers were removed. 16 living areas surrounded a spacious central courtyard, with food and water readily available throughout. The enclosure was designed to accommodate up to 3,840 mice. Apart from providing medical care, he made no further interventions in the mouse population. Initially, the mice struggled to adapt to the new environment and needed time to adjust. They even fought each other, resulting in injuries and deaths. By day 144, the mice entered a new phase. They reproduced rapidly, and the population doubled within 55 days. Growth continued until day 315, after which it began to slow down. From this point on, much like in previous experiments, strong mice dominated specific living areas, while weaker mice concentrated in the central zone, staying only in that location. However, the male mice were unable to cope with the growing number of younger males. They became too exhausted from defending their territories and their females. At this point, the female mice took on both parental roles. They had to care for their pups and protect their nests. The females became increasingly aggressive, even injuring their own young. By day 560, John B. Calhoun believed the mouse population had collapsed, and extinction was just a matter of time. At this stage, the population no longer grew, with the maximum number reaching about 2 to 200 mice. From day 560 onward, the collapse phase began. Almost all of the pups born during this period had severe mental health issues. They were abandoned by their mothers when they were young and lacked the care they needed. The mouse population gradually declined as the ability to nurture was lost. On the other hand, the male mouse lost all desire to mate. They no longer wanted to fight other males to claim a female for themselves. Instead, they lived a life of indulgence, enjoying unlimited food and focusing on self-care, sleeping frequently and grooming their own fur. John B. Calhoun referred to them as pretty boy mice. It was these mice that brought an end to the Society of Mice in Calhoun's experiment. He predicted that the last male mouse would die on day 1780, after which Universe 25 would come to a complete end. Could the fate of this mouse population represent humanity? No one has a definitive answer, but at the very least, it prompts us to reflect on the future of human society.